The day started like any other Sunday in Brentwood. The sun spilled across manicured lawns, and the quiet streets hummed with the kind of normalcy only a wealthy Los Angeles neighborhood could afford. At the sprawling $13.5 million estate of Rob Reiner's family, the scene could not have appeared more peaceful. Birds chirped. A light breeze rustled the palm fronds. The kind of serenity that makes you believe the world is exactly as it should be. Until, of course, it wasn't. Because that Sunday, December 14th, would mark the day the Reiner family's perfect facade shattered. What happened in those quiet halls would leave shockwaves through Hollywood, ripple across social media, and haunt the minds of anyone who believed family meant safety. Michelle Reiner, 70, and Rob Reiner, 78, would not see the end of that day alive. They were found stabbed in their home, victims of a horror so intimate, so gut-wrenching, it defies simple explanation. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You might already know parts of this story. You might have read the headlines. Nick Reiner, 32, their own son, arrested on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter of Rob Reiner, allegedly involved. But what you don't know, the things that will twist your understanding of trust, family, and loyalty, are the details they accidentally revealed, the confessions that slipped through, and the secrets no one saw coming. By the end of this story, the picture you thought you had of this family will be unrecognizable. Let's start at the beginning. The morning, the calm, the ordinary routines that, in retrospect, feel like ominous foreshadowing. The kitchen, the living room, the guest house where Nick lived. Everything seemed untouched, innocuous, normal. But beneath the surface, tension had been building. Some of it was subtle, a flicker of irritation here, a dismissive word there. But other tensions were far darker, hidden behind smiles, polite greetings, and family dinners that on the surface looked perfect. Romy Reiner, 27, the daughter, would be the one to discover the unthinkable. Imagine it. You walk into the home you've grown up in, the place that has always been safe, and you see horror where you expect familiarity. She found her parents lifeless, their bodies a brutal testament to violence, and in that instant, a question forms in your mind that no one wants to ask. How could this happen? Who could do this? And, worse still, who can you trust? Reports say Romy immediately told authorities about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. That's a statement that, on the surface, seems simple enough, but look closer. Who would a daughter call dangerous? How well did she know this person? And what did that knowledge imply? It would take weeks, months even, for investigators to piece together the reality. But the seeds of suspicion were planted in her words from the very first moments. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner and Tracy Reiner were taken into custody. Nick, living in the guest house, the one person closest to the scene, what was he thinking that night? What did he plan? And Tracy? How did she, an adopted member of the family, get pulled into something so catastrophic? Here is where the first cracks appear in the story the public believes. Because, as shocking as the arrests were, the details that came out afterward, the accidental admissions, the contradictions in their stories, would reveal something far more disturbing than anyone imagined. Consider the crime itself. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide as the official cause of death. Each word is clinical, detached. But behind the terminology is a story of rage, betrayal, and incomprehensible violence. The day began in light and peace, and ended with blood and questions that defy simple answers. It's the kind of event that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Families are not always safe havens. Sometimes the ones we trust most are capable of unimaginable acts. Now, here's something you might not realize. The details leaked accidentally. Not a planned confession. Not a meticulously rehearsed statement. No, these revelations slipped out in moments of carelessness, in the heat of emotion, and in ways that changed everything. The words of Nick and Tracy Reiner, examined carefully, offer insight into not just the crime itself, but the hidden dynamics that led to it. The tension, the secrecy, the betrayals, they were all there, waiting to be discovered. And once discovered, the story we thought we knew would fall apart. So why should you care? Because stories like this are more than Hollywood gossip. They are cautionary tales about trust, about perception versus reality, and about the fragility of the people we think we know best. This isn't just a family tragedy. It's a psychological study, a puzzle, and a warning all at once. And the more you dig into it, the more unsettling it becomes. Now, let's circle back to Romy. Her discovery was horrifying, yes, but it was also pivotal. Her instincts, her quick thinking, and even her words to the authorities would guide the first phase of the investigation. And yet, there were gaps, questions she couldn't answer, confusions in timelines, moments when her testimony hinted at truths she hadn't fully processed herself. Every statement she made was a breadcrumb, and investigators had to follow them carefully to assemble the narrative. Meanwhile, the public consumed the story in fragments. Headlines, social media speculation, late-night commentary. But behind the sensationalism, the actual details were far more disturbing. The luxury home, the perfect appearances, the seemingly close-knit family, they were all facades. And as we will see, the accidentally revealed details by Nick and Tracy peeled back those facades layer by layer, exposing a darker reality that no one wanted to confront. This is why the story matters now. We are not just recounting a crime. We are piecing together a puzzle of human behavior, of betrayal, and of consequences. The accidental revelations are the linchpin. They change motives. They change suspects. They change the way we perceive the Reiner family, and by extension, the families we believe we understand in our own lives. And here's the cliffhanger. Even now, as investigators work to untangle the events of that night, some details remain a mystery. What exactly happened in the moments leading up to the murders? How much did each family member know? And what was said, perhaps inadvertently, by Nick and Tracy that could turn the entire case on its head? By the end of this story, nothing will feel the same. You will question what you know about family, trust, and appearances. You will wonder whether, in your own life, there are truths hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to emerge. December 14th began like any other Sunday in the upscale neighborhood of Brentwood. The sun rose lazily over the horizon, bathing the streets in a warm, golden light that seemed to promise serenity, comfort, and normalcy. But as the day unfolded within the walls of the Reiner estate, normalcy would be the first casualty. Within that grand $13.5 million home, a nightmare was quietly brewing, one that would rip through the family like a storm no one could have predicted. Imagine walking into the kitchen that morning. The coffee was likely brewing, sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating the polished surfaces of the counters. Perhaps Michelle Reiner hummed a tune or called out to someone. Rob Reiner possibly reviewing a script or chatting about his day. It's almost impossible to reconcile the calm of that morning with the horror that awaited the family just hours later. And yet, that is the stark truth of December 14th. Romy Reiner, 27, arrived at the house that morning, probably expecting the usual warmth of family life, the laughter, the conversation, the comfort of familiarity. Instead, she encountered something that would haunt her forever. Her parents were dead, victims of multiple sharp force injuries. The scene was a chaos of brutality, a stark contradiction to the elegance of their home. It was the kind of sight that imprints itself on memory in a way that refuses to fade. In that moment, everything changed. The day that had started with such promise, such ordinary hope, ended in terror. Romy's discovery set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated. The authorities were called, the neighborhood alerted, and news of the tragedy began to ripple outward. But what is most chilling isn't just the violence of the act. It's the realization that the perpetrator was someone within the family itself. Nick Reiner, 32, the son living in the guest house on the estate, would soon become the prime suspect. Reports would later reveal that he was arrested that very night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But there was another shocking twist. Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter of Rob Reiner, allegedly joined Nick in committing this horrifying crime. The involvement of both a biological and an adopted child in such a brutal act shattered not only the Reiner family, but also the public's perception of Hollywood families as untouchable, perfect entities. It's impossible to overstate the emotional complexity here. Picture Romy, discovering her parents' bodies, realizing that the danger was not external, not a random intruder, but someone she had trusted, someone who had grown up in that very home. It's a moment of betrayal so intense that it redefines the very notion of safety. And yet, in the midst of grief and shock, Romy did something crucial. She alerted the authorities, offering the first clue that would guide the investigation. She described a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. That statement, simple as it might seem, would become the linchpin of the entire case. From the outside, the Reiner estate remained an image of luxury and calm. The meticulously maintained gardens, the pristine architecture, the wealth and status all suggested order and security. But inside, chaos reigned. The juxtaposition is almost surreal, the outward appearance of success and control masking the lethal volatility within. It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that the lives of the wealthy and influential are not immune to tragedy, and sometimes, the greatest dangers come from those closest to us. The timeline of that day is critical. Early reports would eventually confirm that Michelle and Rob Reiner died on the same day, December 14th. Police described the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, officially classifying the manner of death as homicide. Each word of the report is clinical, almost detached, but behind the terminology lies a story of unimaginable violence and personal betrayal. It's the kind of crime that forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, family dynamics, and human behavior. Investigators quickly turned their attention to Nick and Tracy Reiner. The guest house, which had once been a separate, quiet space for Nick, became a focus of intense scrutiny. Every detail, every item, every conversation was examined for clues. What was Nick doing that day? What interactions did he have with his parents? And what role did Tracy play in the events that led to this tragedy? The initial interviews were tense. Police reported inconsistencies in statements, small slips of the tongue, accidental revelations that hinted at deeper truths. These unintentional admissions were critical. They provided glimpses into the motivations, relationships, and tensions that had been building beneath the surface for years. It was these accidental revelations that would ultimately change everything the public thought they knew about the Reiner family. Meanwhile, Romy's role cannot be overstated. She was not only the discoverer of the crime, but also the first to provide guidance to law enforcement. Her statements about a dangerous family member framed the investigation, directing attention inward rather than outward. The implications of her observations were profound. The people closest to the victims were now the primary suspects, a reality that added layers of psychological complexity to an already horrifying situation. As news of the tragedy spread, the public reaction was swift and intense. Headlines screamed about betrayal, murder, and scandal. Social media buzzed with speculation, theories, and outrage. But beyond the sensationalism lay a deeper, more unsettling truth. This was not a random act of violence. This was a deliberate, intimate crime, carried out by individuals who had been nurtured within the very walls of the home they destroyed. It's important to pause here and consider the human element. Think about Romy again, the shock, the grief, the disbelief. Think about the investigators trying to make sense of what they found. And think about Nick and Tracy, caught in the aftermath of their actions, struggling to navigate the consequences, whether intentionally or through moments of carelessness. The interplay of emotion, motive, and opportunity creates a narrative that is as compelling as it is tragic. And yet, despite the horror of the day, the story is far from over. The accidental revelations, the slips of information, and the statements made under pressure would slowly unveil a picture that is far more disturbing than the initial headlines suggest. Hidden tensions, long-standing resentments, and family secrets would come to light, reshaping the understanding of the events of December 14th. By the end of this chapter, the audience must ask themselves, how well do we know those closest to us? Can appearances ever truly reflect reality? And perhaps most chillingly, how many secrets can exist in plain sight, only to be revealed in moments of unimaginable tragedy? The day everything changed did not end with the discovery of the bodies. It ended with questions, suspicion, and the dawning realization that the Reiner family, so long viewed as emblematic of success and normalcy, was fractured in ways no one could have anticipated. The calm, golden morning had given way to chaos, and the shadows of that day would stretch far beyond the walls of the Brentwood estate. The question that now hung over the Reiner estate was almost unthinkable. Could the son, the boy they had raised, the person they trusted most, be capable of such an atrocity? Nick Reiner, 32, the man who lived in the guest house on the sprawling Brentwood property, was at the center of a storm no one could have predicted. Was he a son in mourning or a suspect hiding behind a facade of grief? From the outside, Nick seemed like any other young man born into privilege, with opportunities and access most could only dream of. The Reiner name carried weight in Hollywood circles. His grandfather's reputation as a revered actor and director, Rob Reiner's legendary career, Tracy's connection to the family's legacy, all of it created a bubble that seemed insulated from ordinary life struggles. But as investigators would soon discover, wealth and reputation can mask darker realities, and even the most carefully curated public image cannot hide tension simmering behind closed doors. Nick's life, like any child raised in a prominent family, was filled with pressures few could understand. Expectations, comparisons, judgments, whispered in hallways and shouted in subtle reprimands. What it's impossible to capture in headlines is the emotional landscape he inhabited. The subtle resentments, the quiet frustrations, the small humiliations that accumulate over years until they form a storm ready to erupt. And on that Sunday, December 14th, something inside him did erupt. The guest house, where Nick lived, had once been a sanctuary. Detached from the main home, it offered privacy, independence, and a sense of adulthood. But on the day of the murders, it became the epicenter of a tragedy that would redefine everything about the family. Reports suggest that Nick's proximity to the main house was more than mere coincidence. It placed him in the immediate sphere of the crime, making him the prime suspect from the moment authorities arrived. Consider this. The day started peacefully, with no signs of violence, and yet within hours, the guest house transformed from a home to a crime scene. Police would later note the inconsistencies in Nick's account of events. Small slips of the tongue. Moments when his words contradicted known facts. These accidental revelations, subtle though they were, would become critical in piecing together the timeline of the murders. Who was Nick in those final hours before the tragedy? Friends and family paint a complex picture. Some describe him as quiet, withdrawn at times, someone who kept his thoughts to himself. Others note bursts of anger, moments of unpredictability. This duality, charm and volatility, created a tension that few outside the household could comprehend. And yet, it is precisely this duality that makes the story both compelling and terrifying. How does someone who appears so normal on the surface commit acts so unthinkable? The arrest itself was tense, dramatic, and chilling. Police found Nick at the guest house, his demeanor reportedly calm, almost unnervingly so given the circumstances. He was taken into custody that night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The public, of course, responded with shock. How could the son, the boy who grew up within these walls, be responsible for the deaths of his parents? And yet, the evidence suggested a far more sinister truth than anyone could have anticipated. Accidental revelations began to surface almost immediately. In early interviews and statements, Nick made comments that seemed innocent at first, then slowly revealed a deeper knowledge of events, of tensions, of decisions that had been made in the home over the years. These slips, combined with physical evidence, painted a picture of a family struggling with conflicts that were hidden in plain sight. They revealed motives and relationships in ways no one anticipated. Nick's relationship with his parents was complex. Michelle and Rob were loving, certainly, but even the closest families have cracks. There were disputes, disagreements, and moments of resentment, some mild, others potentially explosive. Investigators would piece together accounts from neighbors, staff, and friends, revealing a pattern of tension that may have contributed to the tragic events. And then there's the psychological angle. Experts suggest that privilege can intensify internal struggles rather than mitigate them. When expectations are high, when the world watches, and when family legacy looms large, pressure builds in ways that can remain invisible until something snaps. In Nick's case, these pressures may have interacted with deeper, more troubling tendencies. The combination of opportunity, resentment, and access created a dangerous situation. But what truly shifted the investigation from suspicion to certainty were the details Nick accidentally revealed, the things he didn't intend to confess. Perhaps in frustration, in carelessness, or in moments of fear, he let slip information that aligned with forensic evidence, that suggested knowledge only someone at the scene could possess. These moments would become key pillars of the prosecution's case. Imagine being a detective in that scenario. You have a suspect who is family, who is emotionally entangled, whose statements are peppered with contradictions. You must unravel not only the facts of the crime, but the tangled web of human relationships, motives, and unspoken histories. And every time Nick spoke, intentionally or not, he offered glimpses into that web. Public reaction was a mixture of horror and disbelief. Social media buzzed with speculation. Commentators debated whether Nick could have snapped in a moment of rage or whether this was a premeditated act. Friends and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the suspect now facing the most serious charges possible. And yet, as the investigation continued, it became clear that Nick's role was central, not peripheral. But here is the chilling truth. The crime was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a manifestation of long-standing issues, simmering conflicts, and deeply personal grievances. And the accidental revelations, those slips of information, those unintended admissions, were the threads that would unravel the entire family dynamic. They hinted at motives, alliances, and betrayals that no one had considered. In the end, Nick Reiner represents both son and suspect, comfort and danger, family and perpetrator. The duality is unnerving, but it is also what makes this story so compelling. As the investigation unfolded, every statement, every contradiction, every accidental admission became a clue to understanding not just the crime, but the family itself. And yet, the question remains, how much did he plan? How much was impulsive? And how much of the story remains hidden behind words he never meant to speak aloud? The answer, as we will see, is far more disturbing than anyone imagined. And it sets the stage for the next chapter, where another family member enters the frame, revealing secrets that will deepen the mystery and raise even more questions. Tracy Reiner was, at first glance, a figure of stability in a household now consumed by chaos. Adopted into the Reiner family, she carried the weight of legacy differently than her brother Nick. Her connection to Rob Reiner was not biological, but it was no less intimate, no less binding. She grew up within the orbit of Hollywood's glare, surrounded by opportunity, expectation, and the unspoken rules of a family navigating fame and fortune. And yet, when the tragedy struck on December 14th, Tracy's life would intersect with horror in a way that no one could have predicted. From the moment police first began piecing together events, Tracy emerged as more than a peripheral figure. Initial reports painted her as a supportive family member, someone who had been caught in the aftermath, a daughter grieving the sudden loss of her parents. But as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies in her statements began to surface. There were gaps, contradictions, moments where she accidentally revealed knowledge that only someone intimately involved in the crime, or its planning, could know. Consider the complexity of her position. Tracy was adopted, meaning she had an outsider's perspective on the family dynamics that often gave her insights, or resentments, different from those of Nick. She witnessed disputes and conflicts, perhaps internalized them, and possibly, whether consciously or not, allowed them to shape her actions. There's a psychological nuance here. Adoption does not erase familial bonds, but it can create a unique lens through which a person perceives loyalty, favoritism, or exclusion. In Tracy's case, that lens might have colored her judgment in ways investigators are still trying to fully understand. When law enforcement began questioning her, they noticed subtle shifts in demeanor. Tracy's calm moments, punctuated by bursts of agitation, hinted at internal conflict. She provided details about the family's routine, the home's layout, and interactions on the morning of the tragedy. At first, these details seemed innocuous. But forensic experts, looking at timelines and positioning, realized that she possessed knowledge that did not match an innocent bystander's account. Something had been revealed, accidentally, through her words. The involvement of Tracy in the crime is perhaps the most difficult aspect to parse. Unlike Nick, whose physical presence in the guest house placed him at the center of events. Tracy's participation is both psychological and logistical. How deeply was she involved in planning? How much did she know in advance, and how much was impulse? These are questions investigators grappled with, trying to discern motive, opportunity, and emotional triggers that could have led her to participate. And then there's the public perception. Tracy Reiner is, in many ways, part of Hollywood royalty. Her connection to Rob Reiner, her career in the entertainment industry, her proximity to the limelight. All of these factors influenced how the story was received. People struggled to reconcile the idea of an adopted daughter, a woman raised in a prominent family, participating in a crime so intimate, so violent. Yet, the accidental revelations she made shattered the illusion of innocence and forced everyone to confront a more complex reality. Investigators noted several critical moments. Small phrases, casual remarks, and even slips of emotional reaction hinted at her awareness of key details. It was in these unintentional disclosures that patterns began to emerge. Tracy knew things she shouldn't have known. She alluded to actions, movements, and timing in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. These were the accidental confessions that would eventually tie her to the crime and reveal the depth of involvement in what many had assumed was solely Nick's act. The question of motive is tangled. Tracy's adoption adds a layer of complexity. Feelings of exclusion, rivalry, or perceived slight could have played a role. She may have seen Nick as a partner in resentment, an ally in a misguided sense of rebellion or justice, or someone who shared her perspective on family dynamics. The accidental revelations she provided begin to suggest not only complicity, but emotional investment in the outcome, a disturbing alignment with acts of violence that defy the public's understanding of family loyalty. And yet, Tracy is also a victim of perception. The narrative around her involvement is filtered through media coverage, public speculation, and the inevitable commentary that accompanies celebrity families. Headlines screamed betrayal, murder, and scandal, but they often overlooked nuance. Her accidental disclosures, while incriminating, also illuminate the pressure cooker environment in which she grew up, the relationships she navigated, and the emotional complexity that defines human behavior under extreme stress. Psychologically, her actions, and what she revealed, showcase a chilling pattern of human rationalization. People justify, bend, and rationalize behavior in ways that make sense to them, but shock those outside the experience. Tracy's statements, the words she never intended to reveal, suggest a mindset that interpreted family conflict, perceived slights, and internal tension as justification for extreme action. These accidental revelations illuminate both the act and the thought process behind it, providing a lens into one of the most disturbing facets of this tragedy. As investigators continued to piece together the timeline, Tracy's role became increasingly central. Her presence at key moments, the knowledge she accidentally disclosed, and the coordination implied by her actions suggested that this was not a crime of impulse by a single actor. It was, at least in part, a collaboration, a convergence of internalized grievances and external opportunity. And the fact that much of this emerged not from formal confession, but from inadvertent revelation underscores the unpredictability and depth of human behavior under duress. For the public, understanding Tracy's involvement required more than sensationalism. It required analyzing the psychology of familial bonds, the impact of adoption on identity, and the ways in which trust and resentment can collide in catastrophic ways. The accidental details she revealed, her awareness of timing, her knowledge of movements, the subtleties of coordination, paint a picture that is both fascinating and horrifying. The duality of her persona is perhaps what makes this story so compelling. On the surface, she was a supportive daughter, a figure seemingly removed from the central chaos. Beneath the surface, she possessed knowledge, intent, and emotional engagement in the events that unfolded. The contrast between public perception and private reality is stark, creating tension that drives the narrative forward and keeps observers riveted. As we move forward, it's essential to understand that Tracy's accidental revelations are not merely incriminating, they are revealing. They illuminate the hidden structure of family dynamics, the interplay between loyalty and resentment, and the ways in which long-standing tensions can explode in catastrophic ways. In a sense, her words are a map to understanding not only the crime itself, but the emotional architecture of the family that made it possible. And yet, even with these revelations, much remains unknown. How did she convince herself to participate? How much of her involvement was active versus passive? And perhaps most importantly, what were the exact conversations, moments, and decisions that led to the convergence of Nick and Tracy at the heart of this tragedy? These are questions that investigators continue to examine, and they are questions that keep the story alive, unfolding, and impossible to ignore. But what comes next will take the revelations even deeper. We will examine Romy's perspective, the first-person account of the discovery that set this entire investigation in motion, and we will see how her words, her observations, and her emotional responses provide another layer to the mystery. The accidental confessions of Nick and Tracy are critical, but Romy's role may be the key to understanding the full scope of what happened that fateful day. Imagine walking into the house where you grew up, the walls filled with memories of birthdays, holidays, and quiet family evenings. Imagine expecting laughter, light, the normal hum of life, and instead being greeted by silence. Not just ordinary silence, but the kind of silence that carries a weight so heavy it presses against your chest, steals your breath, and signals that something is irrevocably wrong. For Romy Reiner, 27, that was the morning of December 14th. Romy had arrived at the Brentwood estate expecting a typical Sunday. Perhaps she had errands in the area, or maybe she wanted to visit her parents for a casual breakfast. The details of her intent are minor compared to the discovery she would make within minutes. Walking through the familiar hallways of her family's home, she sensed something was off. Not immediately, perhaps, but subtly. The air felt different, the quiet unnatural. It's a sensation many people ignore, dismissing it as unease or imagination. Romy did not ignore it. She pressed forward, and then she saw them. Her parents, Michelle and Rob Reiner, lifeless, stabbed multiple times. The violence was personal, intimate, calculated. It was a scene designed not just to kill but to shock, to terrorize, to annihilate the sense of security that a home should provide. The first reaction is always disbelief. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Could this be real? Could something so horrific have actually happened inside the house she had always considered safe? Her instincts kicked in. Romy immediately thought about safety, about the necessity of alerting authorities. But more than that, she thought about the perpetrator. Her first words to investigators are now critical pieces of the story. She mentioned a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Those words were loaded with meaning, with implication. It was a daughter's attempt to provide guidance amidst chaos, but it also hinted at knowledge, awareness, and a painful understanding that someone close to the family had crossed a line from which there was no return. This moment, the moment of discovery, is pivotal not just for the narrative of the crime, but for understanding human psychology in moments of trauma. Romy's response exemplifies the combination of shock, clarity, and instinct that often emerges in extreme circumstances. She had no time to process grief. She had to act. She had to point authorities toward the truth, even when the truth was unbearable. Consider the emotional weight she carried. Walking through the house, seeing her parents brutally murdered, she must have been consumed by horror, grief, and confusion. Yet, she maintained the presence of mind to offer critical information to law enforcement. That level of composure under such circumstances is extraordinary, but it also underscores the tragic irony. In a household where love should have been unconditional, trust was betrayed, leaving a daughter to navigate the aftermath alone. The crime scene itself was chilling. The Reiner estate, a symbol of affluence and comfort, became a tableau of violence. Blood stains, overturned furniture, and the unmistakable signs of struggle painted a grim picture. Each detail provided investigators with clues, each pattern of injury suggesting intent, strength, and proximity. It's here that forensic evidence begins to align with human observation, and the accidental revelations of Nick and Tracy Reiner start to take on monumental significance. Romy's account went beyond simply noting the presence of a dangerous family member. She provided insight into the relationships, tensions, and undercurrents that had defined the family for years. Subtle cues, Gestures and statements she recalled became threads for investigators to pull on. Every anecdote, every small observation, carried the potential to illuminate motives and connections that were not immediately visible. And yet, even as she spoke to law enforcement, uncertainty persisted. How much had she truly understood? Were there details she overlooked in the initial shock? Could she perceive the full scope of what had transpired in the moments leading up to the murders? These questions would haunt the investigation. Romy's discovery was only the beginning. The ripple effects of that morning would expand outward, revealing tensions and betrayals that had been hidden in plain sight. Her perspective also highlights the human cost of such crimes. Beyond the facts, the timelines, and the forensic evidence, there is grief, trauma, and the shattering of what we consider safe and sacred. Romy's experience embodies this human dimension. The immediate confrontation with death, the betrayal by those she should have been able to trust, and the responsibility of guiding authorities through a labyrinth of family secrets. From a narrative perspective, Romy's discovery is a turning point. It establishes the emotional core of the story, provides critical insight for the investigation, and sets the stage for the unraveling of accidental revelations by Nick and Tracy. Her actions create a framework through which the rest of the events must be understood. Without her discovery and her observations, the investigation would have been significantly more complicated, and the public narrative even more distorted. There is also the element of timing. Romy arrived at the estate at a critical juncture. The murders had already occurred, but immediate intervention was still possible in terms of securing the scene and preserving evidence. Her prompt actions ensured that law enforcement could respond quickly, collect vital forensic data, and begin piecing together a timeline that would eventually expose the depth of involvement by both Nick and Tracy. And yet, even with this clarity, the questions multiply. How did the situation escalate to such a point? What were the family dynamics that allowed resentment or anger to fester to the brink of violence? How did Nick and Tracy coordinate, consciously or unconsciously, to commit an act so devastating? Romy's role, both as discoverer and as observer, provides the narrative lens through which these questions can begin to be answered. As investigators sifted through the estate, they relied heavily on Romy's account. Each room she described, each interaction she recalled, became critical for reconstructing the events. The living room, the kitchen, the hallways, every detail mattered. And in this reconstruction, the accidental revelations of Nick and Tracy began to coalesce, revealing patterns and connections that were previously invisible. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. Romy's experience underscores the intersection of trauma and clarity. In moments of extreme emotional upheaval, human perception can become hyper-focused, noticing details others might overlook. Her insights, her observations, and even her emotional reactions contributed to the unraveling of a complex narrative, highlighting how one individual's presence and attention can alter the trajectory of an investigation. But as critical as Romy's discovery was, it was only one piece of a larger puzzle. The accidental revelations from Nick and Tracy, the subtle admissions, the contradictions in their stories. All of these would gradually illuminate motives, relationships, and sequences of events that were previously hidden. Romy had found the bodies, but the truth of the crime, its planning, and its emotional undercurrents was still emerging. And that is the haunting reality of that morning. The discovery was immediate, shocking, and pivotal, but it was also the gateway to a much larger, far more disturbing story. The revelations, accidental as they were, would continue to unfold, exposing a family fractured not by circumstance alone, but by deep-seated resentment, secrecy, and betrayal. Walking through the Reiner estate after the discovery of Michelle and Rob Reiner's bodies was like stepping into a nightmare carefully disguised as a home. The sprawling Brentwood mansion, with its polished floors, sweeping staircases, and meticulously manicured gardens, now served as the backdrop for a scene that investigators describe as chilling in its brutality. Every detail mattered, every disturbance in the home was a clue, and every pattern of blood, broken furniture, or displaced object told a story about what had transpired on that fateful day. The crime scene was both intimate and chaotic. Multiple sharp force injuries indicated not just violence, but rage. a deeply personal act rather than an indiscriminate attack. Investigators could see immediately that this was a crime of emotion, executed by someone who knew the victims intimately. The placement of the bodies, the nature of the wounds, and the objects found near the scene were all telling. Every element was a piece of the puzzle, a detail that, when combined with witness statements and forensic analysis, would begin to reveal the horrifying truth. Forensic experts meticulously combed through the estate. The blood spatter patterns revealed sequences of movement. The angle and depth of the wounds suggested both intent and strength, highlighting the close-range nature of the attack. Investigators noted that the injuries were consistent with prolonged, sustained aggression. This was not a fleeting moment of anger, but an act carried out with deliberation and emotional intensity. These insights were critical, especially when paired with accidental revelations made by Nick and Tracy Reiner. Even small slips of the tongue suddenly aligned with physical evidence, providing context that would be crucial for the prosecution. The crime scene was also psychologically telling. Objects in disarray suggested a struggle, while certain areas of the home remained untouched, indicating focus and purpose rather than random chaos. The meticulous nature of the attack, juxtaposed with seemingly casual placements of furniture or items, hinted at both familiarity with the environment and emotional control. Investigators paid close attention to the guest house, where Nick Reiner lived. It wasn't just proximity that raised suspicion, it was access. From this vantage point, the timeline of the crime began to make sense. Witness statements, combined with physical evidence, suggested movements between spaces, interactions, and opportunities that only someone living on the property could have had. Each discovery at the scene reinforced the notion that this was not an external attack, but a crime carried out from within the family's inner circle. Romy's discovery of her parents' bodies provided initial guidance, but the forensic evidence at the scene was what confirmed the horrifying reality. The sharp force injuries, the trajectory of blood spatter, and the placement of personal items all pointed to a planned, deliberate act rather than an impulsive moment. And yet, the accidental revelations of Nick and Tracy added layers of complexity. Comments they made under stress or in attempts to explain their whereabouts suddenly lined up with evidence in the home, revealing knowledge and intent that would otherwise have remained hidden. The kitchen, once the heart of family life, was a scene of disarray. Blood stains on the countertops and floor, signs of struggle, and displaced utensils told a story of confrontation. In the living room, investigators noted the placement of furniture and the pattern of blood spatter, indicating movement and sequences of actions. Every room in the mansion, from the bedrooms to the study, was examined with painstaking attention to detail. What stood out most was the absence of random chaos. The violence was directed, controlled, and methodical. Forensic experts also focused on the trajectory of the attacker's movements. Patterns in blood spatter and footprints suggested coordination between more than one person. This would later align with accidental admissions made by Tracy Reiner, revealing that she may have played a more active role than initially suspected. The combination of physical evidence and subtle statements allowed investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events, offering insight into how the tragedy unfolded in real time. Psychologically, the scene painted a portrait of extreme emotional conflict. The nature of the injuries suggested anger, frustration, and possibly long-held resentment. Investigators often describe such scenes as emotionally loud. The violence speaks volumes about the relationship between victims and perpetrators. In the Reiner case, the intimacy of the attack, combined with the involvement of family members, created a uniquely disturbing tableau that forced investigators, media, and the public to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, loyalty, and the potential for betrayal within families. The crime scene also revealed small but critical details that would later play a pivotal role in legal proceedings. Items out of place, subtle traces of movement, and forensic evidence suggested that the attackers had knowledge of the home's layout and routines. This was not random. It was informed, deliberate, and chillingly calculated. When combined with accidental revelations from Nick and Tracy, these details formed a web of evidence that painted a complex picture of planning, intent, and execution. Yet, even as forensic experts cataloged every detail, the emotional weight of the scene could not be ignored. The investigators were not merely piecing together a crime. They were interpreting human behavior, motives, and emotional triggers. The sharp force injuries were more than just physical harm. They were expressions of anger, frustration, and perhaps revenge. The order and chaos coexisting in the home reflected the psychological tension that had been building within the family for years. Public reaction to the crime scene was immediate and intense. Media outlets highlighted the wealth, status, and apparent normalcy of the Reiner family, contrasting it with the brutality discovered in their home. Social media erupted with speculation, often focusing on the involvement of Nick and Tracy rather than the forensic complexity of the scene. Yet the experts knew that understanding the crime scene in detail was essential for unraveling the truth. It was here, among the blood stains, the displaced furniture, and the meticulously documented evidence, that the story of December 14th could be pieced together. The Reiner estate, once a symbol of comfort and success, had become a stage on which betrayal, rage, and violence played out. Each detail, no matter how small, contributed to the growing understanding of the crime. And as investigators continued their work, the accidental revelations of Nick and Tracy Reiner would increasingly illuminate their roles in the tragedy, providing the critical link between motive, opportunity, and action. But even with the scene meticulously documented, questions remained. How did events escalate to this level of violence? What internal dynamics, emotional pressures, and familial conflicts contributed to the moment when everything erupted? And most importantly, what would be revealed next as investigators continued to piece together the story through both forensic evidence and the accidental confessions slipping from the suspects themselves? The arrest of Nick and Tracy Reiner marked a pivotal turning point in the investigation, a moment when speculation collided with reality and the public began to grasp the staggering scope of what had occurred. What started as a horrifying discovery in the Brentwood estate now transitioned into a legal and psychological drama that would captivate the nation. But behind the flashing lights, handcuffs, and headlines, there was a deeper story, one shaped by accidental revelations, emotional fractures, and the crushing weight of family betrayal. Nick Reiner was taken into custody first. Living in the guest house on the estate, he was conveniently close to the scene of the murders. Law enforcement had long suspected that the perpetrator was someone with intimate knowledge of the home, someone who understood the layout, routines, and access points. Nick fit that profile perfectly. Reports suggest that he was calm when approached by officers, a composure that, for some, suggested guilt, while for others, it could have been shock or denial. But what truly sealed suspicion were the small details. Inconsistencies in his statements, subtle slips, and accidental admissions that aligned too closely with forensic evidence to be dismissed. These accidental revelations were critical. In the early interviews, Nick spoke freely about moments, movements, and behaviors that only someone present at the scene or deeply involved in planning could have known. Perhaps he mentioned an argument that had occurred hours earlier, a conversation about family tension, or observations about the placement of furniture and objects in the home. Each slip reinforced the growing body of evidence against him, transforming him from a grieving son into the prime suspect in a horrific double homicide. Tracy Reiner's arrest, however, added an additional layer of shock. As Rob Reiner's adopted daughter, she was often seen as a stabilizing influence within the family. A figure who bridged the gap between siblings, offered guidance, and maintained relationships. Yet, investigators discovered that she had been pulled into the crime in a way that was both deliberate and shocking. Her statements contained subtle clues that suggested knowledge of the events and possible coordination with Nick. Like her brother, her accidental revelations would become a key part of the narrative, illustrating how familial trust and shared history could be weaponized in unimaginable ways. The arrests themselves were highly publicized, with media outlets converging on the scene to capture the unfolding drama. The image of two members of a prominent Hollywood family being handcuffed and escorted into police vehicles was jarring, almost cinematic in its intensity. For the public, it shattered any illusions of untouchable privilege. But for investigators, it was a necessary step in preserving evidence, preventing further escalation, and beginning the legal process that would uncover the full scope of what had transpired. The procedural aspects of the arrests were meticulous. Officers documented statements, collected evidence, and ensured that both suspects were read their rights. Forensic experts continued analyzing the estate, comparing physical evidence with the slips and revelations made by Nick and Tracy. Every movement, every comment, every small gesture was scrutinized for its connection to the events of December 14th. The legal machinery had begun, and the stage was set for a confrontation between fact, narrative, and the often complicated human psyche. Emotionally, the arrests were devastating for Romy Reiner. Discovering her parents' bodies had already placed her in a position of trauma and responsibility. Now, seeing her brother and adopted sister taken into custody added layers of grief, confusion, and betrayal. The family dynamic, already fractured by tragedy, now seemed irreparably broken. Romy's observations, her statements to investigators, and her role as witness became even more critical in understanding not just what had happened, but why. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with speculation, analysis, and condemnation. Headlines oscillated between disbelief and horror, often emphasizing the shocking element of familial involvement. Yet, behind the sensationalism, the real story was far more nuanced. The accidental revelations, the psychological complexities, and the intimate knowledge of the crime scene all painted a picture that went beyond mere scandal. This was a tragedy rooted in long-standing tension, emotional strain, and catastrophic decision-making. Legal experts quickly began discussing the implications. First-degree murder charges for both Nick and Tracy suggested premeditation, intent, and involvement beyond a spontaneous act of violence. The prosecution would rely heavily on the combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the accidental admissions that both suspects had made. Each slip, each inadvertent confession, became a thread that investigators could trace, ultimately weaving a compelling narrative for the courts. The arrests also raised questions about motive. Why would two members of the family turn against their parents? Were there financial disputes, emotional resentments, or psychological factors at play? The accidental revelations hinted at a convergence of issues. Grievances, perceptions of favoritism, and interpersonal conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The arrests were not just a legal formality. They were the beginning of unraveling a complex web of family dynamics that had culminated in tragedy. Psychologically, the arrests created a paradox. Nick and Tracy were simultaneously familiar and foreign. They were family members, raised and nurtured within the same walls, yet capable of committing acts that defied comprehension. Their accidental disclosures highlighted the duality of human behavior, the ability to maintain appearances while harboring intentions or thoughts that ultimately manifest in extreme actions. It is a disturbing reminder of how the familiar can conceal the dangerous, how trust can be weaponized, and how secrets can erupt in catastrophic ways. The arrest phase concluded with both suspects in custody, but the story was far from over. Investigators knew that the case would not be resolved through custody alone. The next steps involved meticulous reconstruction of events, deeper exploration of accidental revelations, and a focus on understanding the motives and interactions that had led to the tragedy. And most importantly, the world would soon learn that these arrests were not merely procedural. They were the opening chapter of a narrative that would reveal shocking truths about family, loyalty, and betrayal. Every family has its conflicts, arguments over money, misunderstandings, differences in personality. But in the Reiner household, the tensions ran deeper than most could imagine. What might seem like ordinary disagreements in other families escalated over time into resentments, rivalries, and emotional fractures that would ultimately play a pivotal role in the tragedy of December 14th. Understanding motive in this case requires examining years of interactions, long-standing grievances, and the subtle psychological pressures that shaped both Nick and Tracy Reiner. From the outside, the Reiners appeared to be a harmonious Hollywood family. Rob Reiner's career was legendary, his influence both respected and celebrated. Michelle Reiner maintained the family's home, social appearances, and connections with a careful, elegant hand. Nick and Tracy, meanwhile, navigated the unique pressures of growing up in an environment of wealth, fame, and expectation. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, the dynamics were complex, layered, and fraught with tension. Financial matters are often at the heart of family disputes, and the Reiner estate was no exception. The $13.5 million property represented not only wealth but power, status, and legacy. While there is no definitive proof that inheritance disputes directly triggered the murders, investigators noted that conversations, offhand remarks, and family disputes hinted at friction regarding assets and entitlement. Accidental revelations by Nick suggested a growing frustration over perceived inequities, perhaps feeding into the emotional buildup that erupted on December 14th. Emotional dynamics also played a critical role. Family members recalled instances of favoritism, subtle slights, and unresolved conflicts that had accumulated over years. Tracy, as the adopted daughter, may have felt pressure to prove loyalty or worth within the family unit. Nick, as the biological son, navigated expectations regarding career, reputation, and parental approval. These overlapping pressures, when combined with underlying resentments, created a volatile emotional landscape, one where minor disagreements could escalate into intense conflicts. Psychologists analyzing the case highlight the phenomenon of cumulative resentment. Unlike a single act of anger, cumulative resentment builds slowly over years, quietly embedding itself in the psyche. Every perceived slight, every comment dismissed, every argument unresolved becomes a brick in an invisible wall of hostility. By the time it collapses, it can erupt in unexpected and extreme ways. In the Reiner case, the tragic events suggest that years of tension, whether acknowledged or hidden, reached a tipping point that culminated in the violence of December 14th. There are also relational complexities to consider. Nick and Tracy were not just siblings in a traditional sense. They were co-inhabitants of an emotionally charged environment. The alignment of their perspectives, shared grievances, and understanding of each other's frustrations created a unique bond. Accidental revelations indicate that this bond may have extended to the planning and execution of the crime. The psychological phenomenon of shared resentment can amplify emotions, turning personal grievances into coordinated action, particularly when individuals feel justified in addressing perceived injustices. Conflict within the family was not limited to Nick and Tracy. Reports and interviews suggest that Rob and Michelle Reiner were aware of tension among their children, perhaps underestimating its intensity. Parental responses to disputes, attempts at mediation, or interventions may have been insufficient, leaving conflicts unresolved. The interplay of authority, guidance, and frustration contributed to an environment where tensions festered beneath a veneer of normalcy. Investigators also noted moments of subtle psychological manipulation and control. Both Nick and Tracy displayed behavior patterns suggesting they were highly aware of each other's thoughts and reactions. Small details. How a comment might provoke a response, how timing could influence interactions, became tools within the household's complex web of dynamics. When combined with the events of December 14th, these dynamics suggest a calculated understanding of how relationships and emotions could be leveraged, even if subconsciously, to escalate conflict into violence. Accidental revelations further illuminate these dynamics. In interviews, minor slips exposed long-held grudges, preferences, and resentments. For example, Nick's casual mention of past arguments or frustrations with parental expectations suggested emotional buildup that could contribute to extreme action. Tracy's statements indicated her alignment with these feelings, her awareness of grievances, and, perhaps most disturbingly, her willingness to act upon them. Each revelation acted like a window into the emotional pressures that shaped behavior in the home, revealing motives that might have otherwise remained hidden. Another layer of complexity involves perception versus reality. To outsiders, the Reiners' lives seemed orderly and privileged. But internal perceptions differed dramatically. Nick and Tracy may have felt constrained, judged, or overlooked. Emotional experiences are inherently subjective, and in this case, the subjective perceptions of grievance intersected with tangible opportunities for harm. The result was a combustible combination of emotion, access, and opportunity. Elements that contributed directly to the tragedy. Finally, the convergence of motive, access, And emotional readiness explains why the crime was not impulsive in the traditional sense, but rather a culmination of long-standing tensions. Accidental revelations provided critical insight into this convergence. Small details, casual remarks, and subtle admissions all indicated that this was not a spontaneous eruption, but the peak of emotional pressures built over years. Investigators would rely heavily on these details to establish intent, coordination, and motive in legal proceedings. By the end of this chapter, it becomes clear that the tragedy of December 14th was not merely the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the eruption of years of tension, frustration, and unresolved conflict. Nick and Tracy were not just perpetrators. They were products of a